Hi everybody and welcome back. I do want to make a quick announcement before we go further in this course and in the lecture. Make sure you read your discussion posts. I posted an announcement online, or you could read this also, but make sure you look at your discussion post this week. It asks you for a case of eyewitness identification. Make sure you actually pick a case where there was an eyewitness issue. Some of you, very truthfully, will be able to use your case from last week for this week because of the issue we had this past week. Just make sure you are very specific and read those discussion posts thoroughly, and make sure you actually respond to the discussion posts in a proper way. So, today we're going to talk about eyewitness identifications. And before we even get started talking about it, we're going to do a quick experiment. I want everyone to look at this face here and study this face, because you're actually going to have to identify this person in a lineup. All right? So study this face, spend some time, pause the lecture if you need to. We're about to study this person's face. All right? Are y'all ready? All right, pick them out. Is it number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, or number 6? I'll give you all some time to think about it and pick something, all right? Okay. Hopefully y'all are ready, all right? It was actually none of them. Right? None of those guys in that lineup were actually the perpetrator. This is actually one of the largest issues that we have in our criminal justice system to date. And in fact, is the #1 leading cause of wrongful convictions in America. Eyewitnesses misidentifying a suspect is responsible for more people being wrongfully convicted than anything else. And you can see that here in this chart from the Innocence Project website. Now, in understanding eyewitness misidentifications, we ask ourselves a couple questions. What can research tell us about factors that influence eyewitness memory? And how can we apply this knowledge to mitigate the role of mistaking IDs in wrongful convictions? Well, to start out, we should use the scientific method for studying eyewitness memory. And this is critically important, all right? Criminologists and psychologists and sociologists use the scientific method and therefore are conducting science in determining all of these things. Some people might have an initial pushback on false confessions or anything that we talk about in this course, or about whether or not social science is actually science. We're using the scientific method, which therefore makes it a science. We can't predict with 100% certainty what an eyewitness will do, nor can we post-dict it. But we can scientifically study it and make predictions about what is likely to happen. Now, how do we do this? Pretty straightforward, right? We create an event. The nature of the event might be changeable. We have the person view a lineup, the type of lineup, the behavior of the administrator we can manipulate, make an identification, and then ask them about their certainty of their identification, right? We could create an event in low light or in high light. We could create an event with a weapon present, with a weapon not present, with cross-race identifications or not. The lineup could be a simultaneous lineup like you guys saw, or a sequential lineup where you only look at one photo at a time. The lineup administrator could say stuff like, take a closer look at number 3. Are you sure that's not the person who did it? And we could see how that affects the identification decision as well as the certainty of the identification. So there are scientific ways to actually study this issue. So how does memory work? Obviously, all eyewitness identifications have to do with memory, so we need to have a quick discussion on memory. Now, we did this a little bit with alibis when we talked about the forgetting curve. But a lot of people view memory kind of like a video, right? Your eyeball is like the lens of a camera. The optic nerve, is the cable from the camera to the recorder. Your memory trace is your recorded tape. Recollection or remembering is just playing it back. And forgetting is just not really being able to find the tape or the location within the tape. The big problem with this, though, that memory is not in any way like a video system, right? Interpretation affects perception. Context affects perception. Expectations affect perception, right? All of those things affect perception. My mother and father are divorced, and my father's remarried to my stepmother, right? That's how it works. When your parents get divorced and remarried, you have a stepmom, right? And so my family this past weekend, we all went to dinner together. My stepmom's interpretation and expectations of the event when we left made her think she had a terrible dinner because she thought my mother was being mean to her. My mother's interpretation and expectations of the event were, boy, I tried really hard to be nice to your stepmother. Aren't you so happy that I am nice to her, right? So all of those things affect perception. We also don't remember all that we perceive, right? So we perceive a lot of sensory stimulus right now. I bet if I were to ask you guys all to close your eyes right now and say what color are the shades in the room you're in, you probably wouldn't be able to, because you perceive a lot of stuff that you don't actually commit to memory. There's also extraneous information that affects what's recalled as well, right? And so memory is really more of a conclusion than a hard and fast thing, right? There are a lot of things that affect what we remember and what we don't, right? And if you think about that in general, right? I remember my wife's birthday really, really well, right? I dated 3 people before my wife, right? I'm not bragging, but I couldn't tell you any of their birthdays anymore. When I was dating them, I knew them, but it's become unimportant, right? Because I'm married to my wife now, and so I don't need to remember all these other birthdays. Memory is a conclusion of what is important, plus what is recalled, plus what is expected, plus the context, plus what we perceive, right? So in building a memory, there's several stages that happen. First is encoding, right? The acquisition of new information, right? Right now, I'm assuming none of you have heard this lecture before, so you guys are acquiring all sorts of new information and encoding it, right? Next, hopefully, in studying this lecture and watching this lecture, you are storing what you're getting also, right? This is how well we remember what we encode, right? And then later on, you guys are going to take an exam, right? And then you're going to have to retrieve that memory, which is recalling what we've encoded and stored. An issue at any one of these steps can cause an issue in identification and just a memory issue in general, right? And so in looking at this, if they're encoding, right, if it's dark outside, you can't encode what the suspect looks like. It could be a storage issue, right? We didn't actually dump it into storage because there was a gun present, and we were so focused and on the gun that we didn't pay attention to the extraneous information of his face. There could be retrieval issues. It could have happened 3 or 4 months ago. The crime happened 3 or 4 months ago when you were out at a bar, and you encoded it and you stored it, but it was unimportant to you, so after a couple days you just dumped what the guy looked like who was part of the fight, or whatever the case may be, right? And so there's a retrieval issue. In looking at that, we again go back to this idea of the scientific method for studying eyewitness memory, and we see that we can create events, for example, that affect encoding or storage. We can create lineup issues that might interact with storage or retrieval, right, in studying eyewitnesses. So, what does research tell us about eyewitnesses? First of all, it tells us that there's 2 different kinds of variables: estimator variables and system variables. Estimator variables are those factors that are beyond the control of the criminal justice system and whose impact on the reliability of an eyewitness can only be estimated. We can't actually know for sure how much these things affect stuff, we can only estimate. System variables, on the other hand, are factors that are under the control of the criminal justice system and stuff we can actually do something about. Now, some variables are a combination of these 2, but the vast majority fall into one or the other. So, let's start with estimator variables. What are some examples of estimator variables? Witness inattention, right? If my wife gets very, very distracted, I could be mid-sentence with her and she'll just start talking about some completely different topic because she stopped listening to me, right? And so if the witness is, let's say there was a bar fight, but I was so involved in my conversation I didn't realize a bar fight happened behind me, I'm going to be a really bad eyewitness. Also, the age and gender of the witness might also play a factor, right? I tend to not really pay attention to a lot of people around me when I'm out. I tend to talk to my friends and not really care. Also, the age is also an issue, right? Like, if you're 90 or if you're 4, the type of witness you're going to be is not going to be all that strong, right? Because you might have some serious memory and perception issues also. Stress is also an issue. For example, if there's a weapon present, I've mentioned this several times, if you're under a tremendous amount of stress, you might be so focused on trying to survive that you don't even pay a single ounce of attention to what the person looks like. And then also viewing conditions. The lighting might be bad. Viewing time. If you only see someone for half a second, it's not going to be great. The clarity of your view, the distance, if there's a disguise present, all of those things are all under viewing conditions that are probably less than ideal when you're the witness to a crime. Now, with those specifically, we'll talk about some more estimator variables. For example, the cross-race effect. Eyewitnesses are usually better at recognizing and identifying members of their own race or ethnic group than members of another race or ethnic group. Why? Well, there's actually a lot of utility to this, right? It actually amazes me in general. Like when you talk to people that are all Asian or all Hispanic, they're able to identify like that Asian person is Japanese, that Asian person is Chinese, that Asian person is Filipino, that Asian person is Vietnamese or Korean or whatever the case may be. I am really bad at doing that, right? But in my life, I don't interact with a lot of Asian people on a regular basis, right? Asian people do. It's the same basic idea of like twins. If any of you have twins in your family or had friends that were twins growing up that were identical twins, when you first met them, it was like, man, I'm never going to be able to tell them apart. But the more you hung out with them, the more you had a need to actually be able to differentiate between the two. And then, suddenly you can tell them apart, from behind, right? You don't even need to look at them in their face to be able to tell them apart. People typically, when they're around people that are like them, will look for these small, different little features to be able to differentiate individuals. Whereas when there's someone who's completely different, like for the sake of argument, an Asian person in a group of white people, we don't need to pay attention to these small individuals. We can look at the whole person and say, oh, that's the Asian person, right? We do this all the time, right, with people also, and it's always funny to me because we'll say stuff and we'll dance around a topic, like if there's like a bunch of white people in a class and one black person, and you're trying to say, oh, who said that thing? And they'll say, oh, it was, the one with the dark hair and the dark eyes and the dark skin and the darkness, but I don't want to say black because I don't want to be offensive, but I'm trying to describe this person to you kind of tangentially. But then all of a sudden, for a lot of people, when you start saying something like that, we think a tan brunette person with brown eyes, at least initially, right? And so we, because we don't pay attention to these little details, whereas if you had just said the black person, everyone would say, oh yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, right? The cross-race effect is because of these kind of issues, right? This is not suggesting that people are naturally racist. This is not suggesting that people are naturally bigoted in some capacity. It's just, if you were a white person and you grew up predominantly in a black neighborhood, you would be able to be a lot better than a white person who grew up predominantly around white people. And groups just in general in society, whether they should or not, tend to kind of just group themselves in people like them. That's why we have Chinatown in all sorts of big cities, and Little Italy and all sorts of big cities and stuff, because people with the same kind of heritage all tend to group together, right? Also, there's the forgetting curve, and we talked about this with alibis, right? Most forgetting occurs right after learning, right? Approximately 50% of what we learn we forget in the first 40 minutes, right? And so the relationship between delay and forgetting is not linear, right? And so we drop off a lot, and then we continue as time goes on to keep forgetting stuff. But it does slow down, but we've already lost the vast majority of what we said within 3 or 4 days. And so it's hard to estimate, if you ask someone, hey, I know you witnessed a crime 8 months ago, can you tell us about it? They're probably not going to be able to give you that much detail because of the forgetting curve. Some other estimator variables. The effects of a co-witness are present. My advisor had a study where she examined co-witnesses. Most crime is obviously witnessed by more than one witness, right? And so eyewitnesses may share information throughout the investigation and identification process. The police might say, hey, you know what, this will be a lot easier if we have all 5 witnesses show up and pick out the person in the lineup. The problem with that, though, is that if person number 2 who witnessed the crime says, I know for a fact it's number 1, everyone else is now suddenly, whether they want to or not, going to take a long, hard look at number 1 and say, do I agree with that or not? And more likely than not, they're not going to challenge that initial information. Post-event information from a co-witness can influence an eyewitness's memory for the event also. If they say stuff like, man, did you see how fast that car slammed into that other car? As opposed to, did you see that fender bender? Witnesses will rate the slammed into the other car as significantly faster speed than what they actually saw, right? Especially if the witness believes a co-witness has a superior memory for the event, this effect of a co-witness matters more, right? Let's say my wife and I were at the bar, and my wife was looking one way, I was looking the other way, and she goes, holy cow, look at this, and I turn around and I just see the tail end of a fight. my wife has a better memory. So if she says, can you believe that that guy started it? I'm going to assume and believe that that guy did start it because my wife had a better memory, right? These are all estimator variables. We can't actually do anything to control these variables. Systems variables, on the other hand, we can do something about. Systems variables include things like the interview technique, as well as the identification procedure. And so this is stuff that the police actually use, right? There's a lineup theory, right? The purpose of a lineup is a memory test that's designed to give investigators more information than they had before the identification, right? It's not a reasoning task. It's a recognition task. And the vast majority of people should be able to, within 5 to 7 seconds, pick out who the person is when they look at a lineup. What a lot of people do is they spend 5 or 7 minutes looking at a lineup and then say, this is the person that looks the most like the suspect, therefore that must be the suspect. That's not what we're actually asking eyewitnesses to do, or at least that's not what we should be asking eyewitnesses to do. Another issue is with selecting fillers. We ask, a lot of times we ask them to pick out a suspect from a lineup, and all 6 people are guilty, or potentially guilty, right? The witness can't actually be wrong. Imagine taking a multiple choice test where you're never wrong. You'd probably love it. I would love to take a test like that, right? But what we should do is, if we're going to use a lineup, right, and we're going to structure it as a simultaneous lineup with 6 pictures all at once, 5 of those people should be known innocent people. Now I know what you're thinking. How could you possibly say they're known innocent people? Well, there's 2 lists of pictures that researchers suggest using. Dead people and people that are in prison at the time the crime happened. Because we know for a fact people in prison didn't do it because they're locked up in prison. And we know for a fact dead people didn't do it unless it's Jesus, because people don't just come back to life, right? That way, if someone says, it's number 2, I know for a fact it's number 2, but number 2's dead, you're like, oh boy, this person's memory isn't that good, never mind. We can't use them. And that's a critical thing, is being able to say, this witness is actually unreliable, we need to move on. That police just don't like to do. Also, instructions to the eyewitness are also pretty important, right? You shouldn't say stuff like, take a closer look at number 3, or good job, you got the guy, or stuff like, the suspect is in this crime, or in this lineup, or the person you identified before is in this lineup. All of those things could bias the lineup and make it more likely than not for them to pick someone who's not there. And in fact, in a meta-analysis of research on eyewitness instructions, we see that biased lineups result in significantly more false identifications than unbiased lineups, right? And so, and this is critically important, and biased lineups don't actually help us get the correct identification any better, right? And so we say, oh well, yeah, but we might be letting innocent people, or we might be letting guilty people go if we use an unbiased lineup. Actually, empirically, we won't. So some systems variables that are present, I've already mentioned lineup presentation method, simultaneous versus sequential. Sequential being better because if you're only looking at one picture at a time, you're not comparing all the pictures to each other. You're looking at one picture and comparing that one picture to your memory, not comparing them all to each other. The investigator bias is also an issue, like I've referenced, and double-blind procedures should be used. The investigator shouldn't know who the suspect is, so the investigator can't inadvertently give any sort of information back, like good job or yay, or take a closer look at number 3. Post-identification feedback is also an issue, right? Verbal behavior, like you just identified a dangerous criminal, causes people to be significantly more confident in their identification, even if they were very unsure. For those of you who've ever played Jeopardy, I'm sure you felt this way before, right? They say, name blah, 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 and you're like, this? And you're very unsure about it, and then you find it's the right answer, and then all of a sudden you're like, see, I'm a genius. Of course I knew it. But it's like, at the time, if I had you bet money on how correct you are, you probably wouldn't put that much down. After hearing the right answer, you're willing to put all sorts of money down. Nonverbal behavior is also an issue, right? Smiling, nods, general demeanor of the examiner can convey disappointment or excitement to the witness, which thereby also affects confidence. Both of these things, again, inflate confidence or decrease confidence and change perceptions of viewing conditions. The witness is going to say, yes, I got the guy. I had a clear view of him. I know it was him no matter what, whereas before they might not have. And in fact, if we simultaneous versus sequential presentation, for one, for studies, for simultaneous lineups have significantly more false identifications than sequential. And again, this was over 30 tests with over 4,000 witnesses. Simultaneous lineups are significantly worse than sequential lineups without actually being significantly better as far as correct identifications. If we look again at the identifications of suspects versus fillers, simultaneous lineups are significantly more likely to identify fillers, as are sequentials. They're significantly more likely to identify, sequential lineups are significantly more likely to identify the suspect versus simultaneous lineups, and simultaneous lineups are significantly more likely to identify fillers than not, right? So sequential lineups, you get the right guy significantly more often than simultaneous lineups, and in fact, simultaneous lineups make you pick the bad guy a lot more. The percentage of not sure responses is significantly lower in sequential lineups as far as not sure. Rejecting the lineup in general happens a lot more in simultaneous lineups. All of these things taken together show sequential lineups are actually significantly more diagnostic, right? We might have a slight dip in accurate identifications, but the false identifications pretty much drop away just by switching from simultaneous to sequential lineups. The AJS National Eyewitness Field Study was a showed that sequential lineups produced a lower rate of identifying known innocent fillers than simultaneous lineups. Sequential was as effective as simultaneous lineups in identifying the suspect, and rejections of the lineup were more common for the simultaneous lineup than for the sequential, which meant that more likely than not with simultaneous lineups, we're saying throw out the whole lineup even if the suspect was present, versus sequential. There's also this idea of confidence and its relationship with accuracy. In general, confidence is actually a super weak predictor of accuracy, though. It's not at all a predictor when it's been changed through post-identification feedback as well. So if the police say, good job, you got the guy, confidence is in no way predictive of accuracy. Under ideal conditions, confidence and accuracy are moderately related for choosers, people who chose a person, but they're not related at all for non-choosers. And jurors tend to overestimate this relationship a lot, right? And so they see someone who says, I know for a fact it was the defendant, he's sitting right there in a trial, in the defendant's seat, I know it was him, and jurors say, oh my God, it must be him. This confidence-accuracy relationship is not actually good. It's not a strong predictor at all. What does this all mean taken together? Eyewitness evidence needs to be treated as trace evidence, like DNA or any other biological evidence. Memory is a form of trace evidence that we cannot actually collect. We can't pick up a person's memory and put it in an evidence bag. The evidence is going to always be changing and degrading. So that means that there will always be potential problems with the original piece of evidence, right? Because of estimator variables, right? There will always be these estimator variables. But if we start treating that evidence as carefully as possible to not contaminate it with post-identification feedback, with biased lineups, with sequential lineups versus simultaneous versus sequential lineups, if we try not to contaminate it, it can be better. Because just like DNAs, if we do contaminate it, you can never go back and retest like you can DNA. I might contaminate DNA and say, oh crap, I gotta throw this DNA out, and then go collect more DNA from the suspect. I can't do that if there's a memory issue. I can't say, let's reset your memory. And that's a huge problem. So we need to do everything we can not to contaminate it. There are no current identification procedures that eliminate the selection of innocent people. There's nothing we can do to stop it from happening unequivocally, but there's a lot we can do to make it occur less often. Kind of like there is, you can get lung cancer without smoking a cigarette. Smoking a cigarette, though, makes it a lot more likely that you will get lung cancer, right? So what we're suggesting doing is, let's just take away the cigarette. Yeah, sometimes innocent people may still be identified, but it's going to happen a lot less than otherwise. Researchers have identified factors that are related to identification errors, and this information can be used to increase the reliability of eyewitness evidence. Can we mitigate the role of mistaken identifications in wrongful convictions? Training seminars educate people about factors that may lead to mistaken identifications, including police departments. Changing identification procedures to science-based practices is a good idea, and expert testimony and jury instructions to educate jurors on the many factors that lead to mistaken identifications are also important. Having experts actually testify in court is also very, very important. This is a quote from Gary Wells, one of the leading eyewitness researchers that says, "Eyewitnesses tend to select the person who looks most like the perpetrator relative to the other members of the lineup." And that's a huge problem that basically boils all of this eyewitness misidentification down, is that person looks close enough to my memory of it, therefore that must be the person. And that can be a huge problem for innocent people. I'd like you guys to click here. There will be exam questions on these videos, so make sure you watch this. This is an eyewitness case example of Ronald Cotton. And if you have any questions about it, please email me and let me know, all right? Thank you all so much, and I'll see you all soon.